The topic we'll be discussing today is whether the salt added to processed packaged foods and restaurant foods poses a health threat to the American public. It has long been thought that a diet high in sodium will have adverse health effects like fluid retention, high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, stomach cancer, impaired renal function, and even asthma. Sodium is an essential mineral that helps control fluid balance with the help of kidneys and affects nerve and muscle function. According to the Food and Drug Administration, Americans should try to consume less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day. And if you are 51 years or older, have high blood pressure, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, or are African American, you should try to aim for 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day. The average American consumes 3,400 milligrams of sodium every day. According to the Center for Disease Control, more than 75% of sodium Americans eat comes from restaurant, prepackaged, and processed foods. Only 5% of dietary sodium is added during home cooking, and only 6% is added at the table. The remaining 12% of dietary sodium occurs naturally in foods. Sodium in processed foods is used as a preservative and to add flavor. Also, it's included in additives that can affect the texture and color of processed foods. For decades, governmental and nonprofit organizations have advised the public against a high-sodium diet. But controversial reports have been released by the American Journal of Hypertension in 2011 and more recently in 2013 by the Institute of Medicine that state that there are in fact no actual benefits to consuming a low-sodium diet and that the data and research that has been produced and used for decades is not consistent enough to substantiate the claim that too much sodium will cause adverse health effects. So, is the 3,400 milligram daily intake of sodium that Americans are consuming actually bad? The FDA believes it is extremely excessive, while the meta-analysis reports released say that low-sodium diets may actually be harmful instead of helpful. In our group, we have Bree and Jenny arguing what has been preached for decades, that a diet high in salt really does cause health problems. On the other side, we have Kelsey and Emily arguing the controversial side that sodium isn't the bad guy we have been told it was for so long. We also have Melissa discussing other factors to consider that could affect both sides and gives us something else to think about in this sodium debate. So the question is a high-sodium diet actually a health threat to the American public?
Increased salt intake leads to many health problems, as well as increased risk for certain diseases. According to the American Medical Association, decreasing sodium intake to an average of 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day, since most people consume a much greater dose, could save approximately $18 billion in healthcare costs and eliminate 11 million cases of hypertension. The most widely known harmful effect of high-sodium diet is related to high blood pressure, otherwise known as hypertension. This happens when excess sodium in the bloodstream causes the kidneys to uptake more water and maintain the concentration gradient. This uptake of water will increase the fluid and volume of blood in the bloodstream. Increased blood volume will put more pressure on your blood vessels and make your heart work harder. The extra work and pressure can harden blood vessels and cause high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, and heart failure. An ongoing cross-sectional study in the United Kingdom suggests that there is a direct link between high sodium intake and increased risk for obesity. In previous studies, it has been shown that high salt intake leads to increased sweetened beverage consumption, in turn increasing your risk for obesity. The study that suggests a direct link between sodium and increased risk for obesity included 785 adults and 458 children that all completed 24-hour urine samples. Results showed that 24-hour urinary sodium levels were higher in obese and overweight individuals as compared to normal weight. After variables like ethnicity, age, sex, and energy intake were accounted for, there was significant evidence that related high salt intake to higher levels of body fat in both adults and children. A 1 gram increase in salt led to a 28% increase risk for obesity in children. Overall, this study, along with many others, provides evidence that salt reduction could potentially reduce the risk of obesity.
Bree, is sodium really the cause of many health problems that Americans have, or could the problem come from another source? Sodium is not the only thing added to processed foods, packaged foods, and restaurant foods that cause a threat to health. Sugar is also added to these foods, which has the same effect as sodium does. With an increase in sugar, the main form being fructose, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, strokes, diabetes, as well as obesity can be caused. According to the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from 2003 to 2006, shows the mean fructose intake being 83.1 grams per day on average. When fructose intake is above 74 grams per day, blood pressure is increased. As an example, in a randomized trial of 74 men who consumed high fructose diet for 2 weeks, had an increased 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure, increased pulse by 8%, increased triglycerides, and fasting insulin as well. It is also shown that people who consume between 10.5 to 24.9% of their calories from sugar compared to someone who consumes less than 10% of their calories from sugar have a 30% more chance of mortality from cardiovascular disease. With the decreasing of sodium in processed foods, this could cause an increased consumption of sugar, which could actually harm us more than what it is now. Now on to Jenny to tell us how excessive sodium affects the cardiovascular system.
The cardiovascular system is one of the main organ systems vulnerable to the adverse effects of excess sodium in the diet. As a result, excess dietary sodium in the diet predisposes to high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and other related problems. There have been many studies over the decades on the effect of salt intake on blood pressure. For example, there's a study in France that looked at the connection between salt and high blood pressure in 1904. They studied 6 patients with high blood pressure for 3 weeks. They varied the salt and protein content for 3 different diets. One had very little salt and consisted of 2 liters of milk per day. The second also had little salt but contained milk, meat, and eggs. The third consisted of 2 liters of milk and 10.5 grams of salt. The salt balance was measured by estimating the amount of salt excreted in the urine each day. They found that when the diet contained very little salt, more salt was excreted, resulting in negative sodium balance in the body. As a result, the blood pressure fell even when there was sufficient protein intake. When the diet was high in salt, less salt was excreted in the urine, resulting in positive sodium balance and also causing salt retention in the body and an increase in blood pressure even when protein intake was low. The study concludes that high salt intake is related to high blood pressure. This conclusion demonstrates that high sodium intake does pose a health threat to the American public.
Yes, Jenny, a typical American diet contains more sodium than needed, which lead to health concerns as high blood pressure. But do you know how low intake of salt can also be bad, especially to athletes? Too little salt consumption can start our beating heart and contraction of all muscles. High intake of salt is associated with hypertension and also can increase calcium excretion, which can lead to osteoporosis over time. And on the other hand, too little salt can lead to hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is a condition that occurs when the level of your sodium in blood is abnormally low. If you drink too much water during exercise, can cause the sodium become diluted in your body. Such an appropriate amount of salt intake is important in an athlete's diet. Exercise is associated with hyponatremia has gained attention in the past 20 years. The low level of the plasma sodium concentration and osmolarity cause cerebral edema and pulmonary edema and death. It is asymptomatic in a mild condition, but the symptom can see as the plasma sodium level drop below the 130 mg per liter. And athletes with hyponatremia will gain weight during exercise seasons and during to the consume more fluids during exercise and they lose in sweat. The excessive drinking and low sweat sodium loss both is the root of the hyponatremia. It occurs more common in women with small stature and longer race time. Hyponatremia can also appear in dehydration athlete who has large loss of both sodium and fluids, so the most athletes should not follow a low sodium diet.
Yes, Emily, sodium does play a major role in balancing the levels of fluid in the body, but a high sodium diet can negatively affect this balance. Kidneys use osmosis to draw extra water out of the body. A high sodium diet can interfere with this process, disrupt the balance in the body, and reduce kidney function. The extra stored water in kidney causes a rise in blood pressure and puts a strain on the kidneys, arteries, heart, and brain. High dietary intake of salt poses a major challenge to the kidneys to excrete large amounts of salt. Over time, not only will the high sodium intake cause hypertension, it can also cause kidney disease.
Jenny, I can see what you are trying to say about high salt intake and risk of for diseases. The two leading causes of kidney disease in the United States are type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. If both diseases are treated, then kidney disease can usually be slowed down or prevented. However, so is just one of those risk factors. The risk factor of cardiovascular disease and hypertension also include physical inactivity, being overweight, diabetes, and high cholesterol. The diet play a crucial role in the development and prevention of cardiovascular disease, and research showed the abnormal blood lipid levels related to diet are related to the risk of coronary artery disease, heart attack, and coronary death. A diet high in saturated fat and trans fat increase the level of cholesterol. If your total fat diet is more than 37 of your total calorie, even the fat is unsaturated and will still increase your risk of cardiovascular disease. In addition, alcohol abuse is a huge issue in America, which lead to high blood pressure. According to National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, there's 86% of Americans aged 18 or older report they drink alcohol at some point in their lifetime, and 70.7% report drink alcohol in the past year, and 56.4% report they drink alcohol in the past month.
When talking about sodium intake, it is important to keep in mind that other factors will take an effect on how the sodium is utilized and how the body will react overall to increase or decrease consumption. Potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium all have a role in one another's regulation. Potassium consumption is one which is most closely related to sodium. Recommended intake of potassium equates to 4,700 milligrams per day for those over the age of 14 and women who are pregnant. However, nursing women over the age of 14 should have 5,100 milligrams per day, and children should consume 400 to 3,800 milligrams per day. If these levels are not reached throughout the day, it deters the body's ability for successful cell signaling. Sodium and potassium work together using the sodium-potassium pump, which pulls sodium into the cell while pushing potassium out to keep the proper ionic balance of fluids in tissues. This balance is vital for nerve signaling and muscle contraction. Calcium also takes a large part in the effects of sodium. Medical researchers at University of Alberta have found that the reason high salt diets lead to osteoporosis and kidney stones is because the same molecule regulates both. So when it is too high of a consumption of sodium and it is expelled from the body, calcium is expelled with it, even if the body doesn't have the recommended levels needed for healthy, strong bone development. One other nutrient that must be monitored in order to have healthy utilization of sodium is magnesium. Magnesium aids potassium when crossing the membrane in the sodium-potassium exchange. According to Linus Pauling Institute, if a person was to have magnesium deficiency, they would have a high retention rate for sodium and low serum potassium levels. While the average population's sodium intake is exceedingly high compared to the DRI, the average U.S. person's intake of potassium, calcium, and magnesium is only at 35 to 50% of the recommended intake per day. This difference in intake largely affects the health risks associated with the average American's high sodium consumption. Beyond this, there are also studies that show high levels of manganese, iron, and aluminum in the body will lead to elevated levels of sodium. This is thought to be because they irritate the adrenal glands and create adrenal burnout, which is found to be true with almost all slow oxidizers. The adrenal gland directly helps to regulate the sodium-potassium levels by using hormones called mineralocorticoids. If too much or too little of these hormones are produced, then it could lead to too much sodium being released into your urine or too much sodium being retained. Therefore, it is important not to overlook the regulation of the adrenal gland when speaking about sodium levels. So, should we be asking the question about the high sodium levels in processed foods, or should we be more concerned about the ratio of other minerals compared to the amount of sodium in the American diet as a whole?
As you can see, there's more than one side to the story when it comes to the effect that salt has on health. On one hand, too little sodium is bad. On the other hand, too high of sodium has been linked to health problems as well. There are specific individuals, like those that are at risk due to predisposed conditions, that should have lower sodium intake regardless. Like stated before, with obesity and cardiovascular disease, when looking at the American diet in general, even with the reduction of processed foods, it could still be problematic. The FDA's definition of processed foods is any food other than a raw agricultural commodity and includes any raw agricultural commodity that has been subject to processing, such as canning, cooking, freezing, dehydration, or milling. This definition opens up a broader range of food than what the typical person generally thinks of being processed. It is important to keep in mind the regulation of sodium in the body and how it influences or is influenced by potassium, calcium, and magnesium. Keeping all these factors in mind, do you think that the salt is the culprit behind these health problems?
Let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.